Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. Here's the president of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments. Our guest today is Mark Silo, historian and very active member of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. Mark is the author of the book, The 115th New York in the Civil War, the unit history of local Civil War regiment. Mark has focused over the past few years on determining the location of the British battle lines during the Battle of Lake George, and that's the subject of the presentation we'll be making on Saturday, January 17th at the Holiday Inn Resort, Lake George, starting at 11 a.m. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark, first, would you please summarize the three skirmishes of the Battle of Lake George and what happened at each one and where it happened?
Sure. The British-American force under recently christened Major General William Johnson organized in Albany through the summer of 1755. They got to this site at the south end of Lake George on August 28th. They started to clear ground and put camp together and laid out what became Fort William Henry. Meanwhile, a French force was coming south under Baron von Dieskau. He took his army toward Fort Lyman, which soon became Fort Edward. When that fort was threatened, Johnson's scouts let him know. He sent a relief force of about 1,200 men down the Colonial Road toward Fort Edward. Dieskau scouts got the better of them. They found out that Johnson's men were coming, and they set up an ambush along the road where there's a steep hill beside the old Colonial Road. And that became what we call the Bloody Morning Scout. The leaders of the British American, and Mohawk force were killed, Chief Hendrick and Colonel Ephraim Williams. Their men started to retreat back to the camp at Lake George, and the French pursued them. That was the Bloody Morning Scout. Meanwhile, the men back in the camp heard the shooting, saw their colleagues trickling back into the camp, and the French approaching, and they had about an hour and a half to 2 hours. They threw up an improvised barricade that they called a breastwork, which was too grand a name probably because it was only a bunch of logs that were maybe 1.5 feet high. But anyway, they prepared that, and the French attacked them along that line. And this was the main phase of the battle. We call it the Battle of Johnson's Camp. The third phase followed that as the French and Indians were retreating from Lake George toward the south where they had come from. They ran into a contingent of British American forces coming up from Fort Edward and had a skirmish. And legend says there were so many dead bodies they were thrown into a pond and it turned red. So this was called the Battle of Bloody Pond.
Okay, and we know there's a Bloody Pond site marked on Route 9 in Lake George by the Queensbury town line. There's also a marked area with a monument to Ephraim Williams connotating the location of the Bloody Morning Scout. But let's focus on the battle at Johnson's Camp, right where today's Lake George Battlefield Park is located. First, the question I asked on the radio program, where were the two commanders, Major General Johnson and Baron Dieskau, located when they were wounded?
Johnson was shot in the thigh early in the battle. A lot of accounts say that he was up at the front line most of the time. So it was early in the battle and he was at the front. He was probably somewhere in the vicinity of where his battle line crossed the Colonial Road, which is now Fort George Road within the battlefield park. We're lucky that it's in the same location it was in 1755. He was taken back to his tent. His wound was dressed, and he returned to the fight, leading his men along the line.
Okay. And Dieskau?
Baron von Dieskau, the leader of the French and Indian force, was wounded later in the fight when most of the action had migrated toward the west, the right side of the British-American line. An account locates him at about 70 paces from the line. And given that stage of the battle where he was hit and the terrain nearby, I'm guessing that would have been within the battlefield campground, somewhere between the American line and what's now Route 9, maybe next door at A&W.
Okay, good. All right, so did the wounding of those two commanders have any impact on the fighting?
Not much on the British-American side. Johnson returned to the battle. The bullet was never removed. It bothered him for the rest of his life, but he was able to return to command that day. Dieskau, on the other hand, was shot in the leg. He had several men helping to move him to safety when two more bullets hit him in the thigh and in the knee. One of the men that was carrying him was killed. So he was laying there when his men retreated, and he was captured by Johnson's men. Johnson took him to his tent. Doctors treated him there. He was gravely wounded, and Johnson actually arranged for him to be transported to his own house, Johnson's house in Albany, where Johnson's sister cared for him, even though her husband was one of the men killed up here in the battle. He was also treated well by the Schuyler family down there, eventually returned to England and then back to France. But he never fully recovered from his wound either.
Okay.
But he was out of the battle and out of the war.
Okay, that's the backdrop. So our story today, what we want to focus on is your presentation on the 17th, which is about defining Johnson's battle lines. To a non-engineer, such as yours truly, although I'm a son of an engineer, that amazes me that you had that dexterity and scientific commitment to do that. So how'd you go about defining where the British lines of 270 years ago were located?
Well, what I found when I started volunteering at the visitor center was that people knew line was about here, about there, but we didn't know exactly where. So I kind of started perusing the maps and trying to figure out, maybe picking out some terrain features that still exist, and they do. And in fact, we're very lucky that the land that's now the campground, the battlefield park, and $1 Million Beach were bought up by the state of New York and pretty well preserved. But the key to finding the locations was a drawing by a man named Samuel Blodgett, who was a sutler, which is a civilian salesman that follows an army and has stuff for sale that they may need, such as blankets and candles and rum. And he sat and observed the battle up where the Fort George was subsequently built. And then immediately after the battle, he interviewed a lot of the men who participated both here at Lake George and the Bloody Morning Scout. And he made a quick turnaround, putting a drawing together that showed the campsites, the terrain, and the battle lines that they used that day. And it was within several months, was for sale, was printed, engraved, printed, and for sale in Boston and then in London. And that, although it's not really a map, it's kind of cartoonish, you might say, but it's very accurate, has a lot of clues, and that was mostly what I built my case on.
Oh, interesting. And we do have that map posted in our Lake George Battlefield Park Visitor Center. We also have copies available if people want to bring them home. But it's kind of sketchy, again, 270-year-old information. What were the biggest challenges you faced in putting more definition in the modern context?
Well, the biggest challenges were that in the course of that 200-some years, some development has taken place, even though most of the public land has been minimally developed. But key features of the battle were either changed or missing, such as a large hill that some of the people talked about that gave way to the Tiki Resort back in around 1960. So trying to take notes that Blodgett left us and on some of the other men and match them up with the old maps and the current terrain, it was challenging. But we had enough clues and enough remains that it came together.
Yeah, and your explanations to me and to others on the tours you've conducted, I think really illuminate the water. I mean, the part of Lake George Battlefield Park that runs alongside Beach Road, for example, was largely swampland. And you can still see cattails, but that kind of suggests that there was a lot more water in the area in 1755 than there is in 2026.
That's true. All what you see is a nice, beautiful park lawn now was labeled as morass on all of the 18th century maps. And it confined the camp and the battle to the high ground that's between what's now the that beautiful lawn and Route 9. But the swamp itself was on the west side of where the Americans took position, was used by the approaching Indians allied with the French and their Canadian provincials to find places, advantageous places, to attack the American line.
Okay. Now, Mark Silo and I are young men still. We have a long lifespan ahead of us, God willing. But someday we're not going to be here any longer. Are there things you'd like to see in terms of more permanently marking the battle lines and the field of battle in general on September 8th, 1755 for posterity?
Yes, for sure. We actually have drafted a sign plan that would guide folks around the park and show them these locations that we've identified and tell them what happened. That's got a long way to go. We need to coordinate with our landlord, the state of New York, and get some grant money perhaps and get that going. I'd love to see that happen. If nothing else, right where the Fort George Road crosses the side of the line, I'd like to see one of those nice yellow and blue state historic signs that says, "Here was the line."
Yep. Okay. All right. Wrapping up. So anything else you'd like to tell us about the other two locations, the Bloody Morning Scout, Bloody Pond? Any opinions on those?
Well, the Bloody Morning Scout, at that location, there's a pullout on Route 9 and a trail downhill and some interpretive signage and the monument to Colonel Williams near the site where he was killed. That's all owned by Williams College, which Williams endowed in a will he wrote in Albany before coming up to Lake George. The college does a good job on property they own, but then as you go down the hill toward now the bike path, used to be the Colonial Road. It's a very rugged trail, not real safe, and we'd like to see that improved and have some better signage down there. And in fact, we're working with Warren County Planning to try to get something going on that.
And anything on Bloody Pond?
Bloody Pond's a different story. We don't really know where Bloody Pond was. There is the site on Route 9 that has the blue and yellow sign and the monument, but there's a lot of people who think it was a marshy area farther east from that. In fact, one of our member and historians, John Eric Nelson, has studied all of the original citations about the battle, and the word pond wasn't even used for some years after the event took place. And the terrain down there has been very much revised by the railroad construction and Route 9 and commercial development. So it's really hard to say where that pond was. So what we can do down there remains to be seen.
Okay. A history mystery, if you will. Reminder, Mark will be presenting Sir William, Where Exactly Were Your Lines on Saturday, January 17th, 11 a.m. at the Holiday Inn Resort, Lake George. It's free, but we do ask that you register in advance by emailing info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org. Mark Silo, once again, thank you for sharing your research with us.
Thank you very much. See you next week.
Okay. Our website's lakegeorgebattlefield.org. We thank you for being a part of our history.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more information or to check out the latest podcast, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and listen live on Saturday mornings to Lake George Battlefield Moments on 93.5 Lake FM.